Okay, so we are having class. Yeah, it's all. Oh, I need to.
Hi there. Hi, Jake. Hi, Luis.
Hello, ma'am.
How are you?
Good, and you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm surprised anybody wants to get on tonight. But I got a few emails from students that said, are we having class? And so um, I decided to go ahead and record at 7 um, in case we had somebody that wanted to get on. So technically the university is closed, but I'm going to record this sometime this week. And if I've got people that want to tune in, that's great. So we'll wait about 1 minute and then we'll go ahead and get started with chapter 4. And welcome. I hope everybody's safe and warm and um, in a good place for electricity and internet. Are y'all secure? And obviously you've got some internet or you wouldn't be on tonight. But,
yes, my Canvas isn't like the Tarleton website isn't working. But if you go through Canvas on your phone, then it lets you join the meeting.
Okay, well, that's good. I know Canvas has been out for most people all day. And even university email was out for about half of the day, maybe more than that. It was clanked up till about, I think, 2 o'clock or so. So I wasn't getting any university email until the afternoon. But Canvas has not been working unless you go through, some other route through the app. But I'm going to extend all of our due dates. And so I don't want anybody fretting about due dates. We'll just not worry about those this week too much. I'll go ahead and open the test tomorrow, but we'll extend it for several days. Probably have everything due the middle of next week, just to make up for this week. And if that's a problem for anybody, we'll extend it for a few more days. Just don't want anybody to fret over due dates having to do with the weather or the electricity or the internet availability or anything like that. So don't let those kind of things worry you this week. Okay. That's for you all that are on tonight and anybody that tunes in later in the week. So if you have issues with that, don't worry, I'll extend due dates on Canvas. And if you've got questions, just shoot me an email and we'll try to get those worked out for you. But don't worry about due dates. We'll take care of those. Any questions from you guys before we get started?
I have a question about the Unit 1 assignment, application assignment.
Yeah.
So me and Michaela worked on I actually emailed you our lesson plan that we worked on.
Yeah.
I don't know what else we're supposed to add to that. Or do we explain like why we chose like station teaching, or is it I don't really know what else to add.
You don't have to add anything else. Did you get my reply to you?
Yes. You said it looks great so far, so I just didn't know if I needed to add anything to it.
No, I think it looks fine.
Oh.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay, perfect.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, I think you're fine on that. And I had somebody asking me for a rubric, and I looked and I couldn't find a rubric from when I assigned that last year. So grading's pretty lenient on that. I just want you to kind of get a feel for what a lesson plan would look like when two teachers are working together. So, I'm not, and you'll see that I'm not a real stickler on detail on things like that. I know some of my colleagues tend to be when you get into these education classes, but for most people, this is one of the early education classes they take. So I'm not a real stickler on things like that. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You bet. So we'll go ahead. This is our very first chapter that addresses a particular disability type. And this is where I think that the course starts to get fun because we delve into each one of those disabilities that we've talked about for the last several weeks. And so this one is learning disabilities. Can you guys see my screen that I've shared that says chapter 4 on it?
Yes.
Okay, good deal. So this is chapter 4 from your textbook, and it's learning disabilities. And so we'll go ahead and dive into that. And I think I've only got 11 slides, so it's not a real long discussion, but I'll talk a little bit about each slide as we go along. So we'll talk first about what a learning disability isn't. First of all, a learning disability is not anything that indicates that a person has a low level of intelligence. I had a girl in this very class several years ago that said that she had been diagnosed with a learning disability when she was growing up, and she always thought that meant she was dumb. And that made me very sad, because whoever evaluated her, tested her, or explained her disability to her did a very poor job, because in order to have a diagnosed learning disability, you have to have at least average intelligence, if not higher than average intelligence. And if a person goes through the whole process of the diagnosis of a learning disability and they don't understand that they've got at least average intelligence, then somebody hasn't done a very good job explaining their disability to them. And you've got to have if you're the one with the disability, you need a clear understanding of what your disability is. So you can advocate for yourself. So you can tell your teachers, and after school, you can tell your employer, other people that you need to communicate with about what your needs are as far as your disability is concerned. So that made me very, very sad for her, that she had gotten all the way to the university level and thought that it meant that she had low intelligence. I always tell students in this class that you wouldn't be in this class at the university if you had anything less than average intelligence. You don't get to this point in your schooling with anything less than average intelligence. You wouldn't have done as well as you did on the SAT or the ACT to get into college. You wouldn't have made it to your sophomore year, your junior year, whatever year you're in right now. You're supposed to be a sophomore to get into this class, or at least have sophomore hours. So you wouldn't have made it this far in your academic career with anything less than average intelligence. So a learning disability, you can have a learning disability and be successful in college because you have to have at least average intelligence to have a diagnosed learning disability. That's part of the definition. So I want everyone to understand that part of it. We do have, and we'll talk about the exact definition that's written in the law in a few minutes, but this is the largest group of students that we have in any of the categories in our disability population. It's about 4% of the general school population. So anywhere around your school, you've got about 4% of all of the kids would have a learning disability. Our textbook says that a little more than 39% of our disability population has a learning disability. But it ranges anywhere from, and according to the school district, 18% to about 60%. Now, my experience, and I've been at this for a really long time, as I have told you all for a number of weeks now. I've been at this since the 80s, the early 80s. And my experience has been closer to 50% of all of the special education population has a learning disability. So about half of all of the kiddos in special education will have a learning disability rather than any of the other disabilities, the categories that we've looked at or will continue to look at the rest of the semester. So this is the biggest group that you as teachers in training will ever see once you get into school systems, or if you're going to work with after school programs, any group of young people or students that you ever work with. If you're ever a scout leader, about 4% of the kids are going to have learning disabilities. If you were to work with just the special ed population, half of that special ed population would have learning disabilities. If you're going to work with a youth group at your church, remember that about 4% of all of the kids are going to have learning disabilities. Or if you're working with just a special ed population, then about half of those kids will have learning disabilities. So wherever you go, you're going to run across people who have learning disabilities. They're everywhere. They're in our class right now. Several of you have learning disabilities. And I hope you know it already. If you do, several of you do, because you've told me that you have accommodations outlined with the Disability Services Office. And that means you're advocating for yourself because you have a diagnosed learning disability. But the causes of those learning disabilities can be myriad, lots and lots of different causes. We don't have just one that we can pin down and say, this is the reason we have learning disabilities. Your book describes all of the ones that you see here on the screen. They can be neurological, something that's misfiring in the brain, brain-oriented brain causes that are going on that cause that learning disability. They can be genetic. That can be neurological and genetic. But if they're genetic, that just means that we see them running in families. And this is not uncommon at all. And we'll talk about dyslexia as a learning disability. That's one that many people are very familiar with. Dyslexia is a learning disability. It's a specific reading disability. But you often see that running in families. You'll see perhaps a parent with dyslexia and then a child with dyslexia, or perhaps a brother and sister that both have dyslexia. Very common to see that running in families. And that's just one example of how learning disabilities do run in families. Even though it's not in this particular category, attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a neurological type of disability that you could file under this first bullet here, and that certainly runs in families as well. It tends to be genetic, and if you or a family member or a friend has ADD or ADHD, you may well see that other people in that individual's family have that as well. Highly genetic. I have a grandson diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and my son-in-law, his dad, also has that particular diagnosis. So not uncommon at all to see that running in families. The third bullet here is environmental. So we can have things that cause learning disabilities that are part of the environment. And then we've broken it down here into 3 stages of the environment. We've got the prenatal, the perinatal, and the postnatal. So the prenatal would be things that happen to the child before they ever emerge from the womb. Perhaps the mother to be is drinking or taking drugs, or maybe just not taking good care of herself in general, not getting enough sleep, or not taking her prenatal vitamins, or other things like that. That are causing problems in the prenatal phase of the child's development. Perinatal is the process of being born. And sometimes there might be a lack of oxygen. Maybe the cord is wrapped around the baby's neck during the birth process, and it deprives the child of some oxygen. That can give cause for maybe some minimal brain damage, and that can cause issues with learning later on. Other things that happen during the birth process can cause issues there. The postnatal is anything that happens after birth. And some of those kinds of things we would consider more traditionally environmental. Perhaps there's a low socioeconomic status in the home. Perhaps there's an improper diet. things like that. Maybe there's a lack of opportunity for the child to have the things that they need in the home setting, and that can contribute to a learning disability. That's a little harder to define when we start looking at, what the causes are in the home versus the causes that are neurological, something that you can look at on a brain scan. But speaking of that, brain scans have been done with individuals who have learning disabilities, and they look very different than individuals who do not have learning disabilities. There are places in the brain that are dark, that when we look at those of individuals without learning disabilities, they're bright. And there looks like there's more activity on the individual's brain scan who does not have a learning disability than the individual who does. So lots of research that's going on there that is helping us to understand the brain of the individual with a learning disability better with time. So a little bit about the history of learning disabilities. We've got 4 basic phases, and your textbook talks about each one of these in more detail than I'm going to right now. But we've got what we call the foundational phase, which runs from the early 1800s up to the mid, well, I guess actually the early mid 1900s, about 1930 or so. So a period of over 100 years, 130 years or so. And this is when a lot of brain research was going on. The medical community, the scientific community was determining that things that happened to the brain did in fact impact learning. And a lot of this research was going on with the military. As soldiers would emerge from war and they would have injuries to the brain, studies would be conducted with those individuals to see that their learning was impacted by the experiences that they had with injury to the brain. They had more difficulty concentrating. They had more difficulty learning new items. They sometimes had difficulty remembering things that they had learned. And so connections were being made at this point in medicine to see that there was a connection between damage to particular parts of the brain and the way it impacted an individual's learning. So the next phase then is this transitional phase that runs from the 30s up to the 60s. And this is when scientists and the medical community began to apply what they had learned with soldiers to children, and to see how that that made an impact on learning in the school setting. And so we had this shift, this transition, if you will, from adults, particularly in the setting of war, to children in the setting of school, and what impact that could have on the pure learning situation that we put children in on a daily basis. The third phase is the integration phase. This is where we really began to apply the observations that were being made in those earlier phases to actual learning in the school setting. It was during this period that Dr. Samuel Kirk coined the term learning disability in 1963. He used that term when he addressed a group of parents and educators at the Learning Disabilities Association meeting. And it was a term, your textbook talks about this a little bit as well. It was a term that that parents, well, and educators as well, really latched onto and liked. And my feeling about that is it explained a lot of things. People like to have a name or a label for something that they haven't been able to explain. And if you can give it a label, then that makes people feel better. There's a reason, there's a cause, and there's a name for what's going on with their child, perhaps something that they haven't understood up to that point. So it was during this period of time that people were beginning to understand a little bit better what was going on with children who had normal or average or typical intelligence, but had a hard time in school. And if you're not one of those individuals, you surely have known one of those individuals, somebody in school with you who was very bright or just like everybody else intellectually, but they struggled with some of their school subjects. And that's who these kiddos are. That brings us then up to what we consider the current phase from 1975 until the present. And that's where we've begun to understand these individuals better and focus more not on definitions and defining who they are, but on focusing on strategies and supports, how we can help individuals who have learning disabilities, what we can do to change the learning environment, give them the strategies that they need to be successful. And it was during the early part of this phase that special education services became available to individuals with learning disabilities in the school setting. And we talked about that leading up to this class today, in that IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, was passed in its first iteration in 1975 as Public Law 94-142, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. And it was then that kids with learning disabilities were really recognized for the first time in the public school setting and were given a nod to get some help that they needed. Now, unfortunately, at that period of time, most of them, if they had any significant need, were pulled out of the general ed setting and placed in a classroom down the hall, rather than being integrated into the general ed setting. And the result of that, in many cases, was those kids didn't get exposure to the general education curriculum. They got put into a classroom where they just worked at a lower level and didn't get that exposure to higher level thinking. And I think that's happened for a number of years with a lot of kids who, if they had had some exposure to a higher level of curriculum, perhaps would have been more successful. So here is the textbook definition, the legal, the federal definition that lawmakers passed way back in 1975 as part of IDEA, the original law, and it hasn't changed at all since 1975. The law reads exactly like it did when it was passed way back then. And it's kind of a clunky definition, but here it is. A specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding and using language, spoken or written, that may manifest in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or to do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Now, aphasia is a speech disorder. Disorders not included, specific learning disability does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, of intellectual disability, of emotional disturbance, or of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. So that last bullet there basically tells us all the things that we have to rule out before we can say that a person has a learning disability. That's our rule out clause. So we've got to say that the primary reason for the disability is not vision, hearing, or motor problems. It's not an intellectual disability, so it's not low intelligence. It's not emotional problems. It's not environmental, cultural, or economic issues as the primary problem. So a person could have some of those other issues, but those can't be the primary cause for the learning problems that are going on. Now, some of the verbiage up there in the top bullet has become kind of antiquated, and we don't use terms like minimal brain dysfunction or brain injury in response to a child with a learning disability anymore. Those are antiquated terms, but they have been left in the law since it began back in 1975. I think this definition needs a little retooling because research has changed things a little bit. But I think people have been afraid to touch this definition since it was originally coined back in 1975. So it's been left alone. It's been left just like it started out. So there you have the definition, and that's what we have to work with. Now, the interesting part is school districts across the country have a lot of latitude on how they define that. When the law was reconfirmed in 2004, the Department of Education in Washington gave us a little bit of a parameter to work with, but not a whole lot. And so school districts and states and school districts have, like I say, quite a bit of latitude on how they define a learning disability. So within the realm of learning disabilities, there are some subcategories. The first one is reading. All of our learning disabilities are specifically academic in nature. And so the first academic area within the realm of learning disabilities is reading. And 90% of all of the kids who have learning disabilities have reading disabilities. And they show these characteristics that are specific to the area of reading. Now, your textbook talks about dyslexia and how it's not a reading disability, that those two things are different. I would take exception with that. And I think a lot of researchers and writers and professors would probably agree with me on that. That's an area of huge debate in the learning disability community, how you define dyslexia versus a reading disability. So I'm not going to get real deep into it, but I would say as you read that part of your book, take that sentence with a little bit of a grain of salt, and know that Dr. Cavan has done a whole lot of research on this too, and spent a lengthy career doing assessments of kids with reading disabilities and dyslexia, and they look an awful lot alike to me. So I'll tell you what some of the specific characteristics are of dyslexia. Some of you may have dyslexia, and you will be able to confirm as I talk about this. Dyslexia is difficulty with the first three, more so even the first two things that you see on your screen here. Phonological awareness, that's basically word decoding. When a person has difficulty sounding out a word, associating the sounds with the symbols. So knowing that the B and the D are different and they make different sounds, and recognizing them when they're in a word. So the best approach that we have for teaching people who have dyslexia how to read is breaking words down and doing a whole lot of drill on phonics. A phonetic approach to reading is the very best thing we can do for people who have dyslexia. It's actually, in my opinion, the very best way to teach reading to anybody. But people who have dyslexia usually need more phonics and need it in more of a direct teach way. Most dyslexia programs take phonics to a whole new level, whereas kids who don't have that kind of difficulty with reading get it faster and can move on from that level of decoding words to more of an automatic word recognition quicker. You'll notice that when you get a little bit older, you don't decode words the same way. you look at the first word there on the screen and you don't have to say ing. You know that that word is learning. You know that the second word is disabilities. You don't have to sound it out anymore. You just look at it and you know. So phonics served you well when you were learning to read, but you don't need phonics anymore unless maybe you come across a really difficult word that's 12 or 15 letters long and you've got to sound it out to be able to pronounce it. You might still use phonics in some of those situations, but generally speaking, you don't use phonics after you learn to read. That's the learning to read part, the decoding part of reading. The second bullet you see here under phonological awareness is rapid automatic naming, or RAN. And that's the fluency part of reading, learning to the flow of reading so that you're not stuck on that that real laborious decoding part of learning to read. So rapid automatic naming is where it begins to come quicker, and no matter what you're doing, whether you're looking at a list of letters or a list of colors or a list of numbers or whatever it is, you begin to do it with more of a flow. That's rapid automatic naming. And one of the things we test when we're looking for disabilities is we test the rapidity, the fluency of all kinds of different things. I might give a student a card, an 8x11 card that has just a bunch of colors on it. Not words, but just the actual colors. And I ask them to name them going across as fast as they can, like as if they were reading across a page. And they just got to say red, blue, yellow, green, purple, red, green, purple, yellow, and say the colors as quickly as they can. The slower they are, the less successful they're going to be as a reader. We want that rapidity to come in order for a person to be able to be a successful reader. The third bullet is word recognition. And this is where we begin to see words as a whole and know them. Sometimes this is what we work with young children with words that don't follow all of the phonics rules, like perhaps the word what, W-H-A-T. It doesn't necessarily follow all of those rules because the W and the H work together. The A doesn't say ah, it says ah, what. And so we want to teach that word as a whole word rather than looking at it phonetically, breaking it down into all those little word parts. There are a number of words like that we want to teach as sight words. And so word recognition begins with sight words. And we teach the recognition of sight words first, and then students begin to put a lot of words into their sight word vocabulary, like I just demonstrated a second ago with the words at the top of the screen that say learning disabilities. Those are part of your sight word vocabulary now. You don't have to decode those. The words characteristics and reading and phonological awareness are probably also in your sight word vocabulary. You don't have to sound those out anymore because you've seen those and they're part of your word recognition memory bank. All three of those are part of the dyslexia issue that we have when a student has difficulty with word decoding. Then the second part of a reading problem is reading comprehension. That's more of the application of reading. So what do you derive from what you've read? Can you make sense of what you've read and answer some questions about it? Well, you never get to that stage of reading if you can't make it through the first three bullets there. If you can't decode words, if you can't have some fluency, some fluidity, some rapidity in your reading, if you can't read words automatically, you're not going to get to the point where you can comprehend, because you're still struggling so much to decode the word that you're not embedding it in your brain to tell yourself the story of whatever it is you're reading. So we've got these actually 3 different components of reading. We've got the decoding, we've got the fluency, and then we've got the comprehension. And word recognition kind of fits in there with decoding. So all of these things work together to make successful readers. And some of you may have struggled learning to read early on, but you've mastered it to some degree now, or you've figured out some strategies in order to be successful enough to be in college. About 25% of all individuals who are part of the learning disability subset are people who have difficulty with math. Now, sometimes there's overlap between our reading group and our math group. We've got people who have difficulty with both. So this is not 2 distinctly separate groups of people. There is some overlap here. So characteristics in math, we've got those who have difficulty with just straight up calculation. When I put, a set of math problems on a piece of paper, they're going to have difficulty with the calculation part. Some have difficulty with those basic math facts, that mad minute kinds of things that many of you probably did when you were growing up. The teacher would give you a page that just had lots and lots of single digit facts, and you had to race to get all of those done in a minute. Those basic multiplication facts, those kinds of things. Understanding of math concepts. What do you do with some of those figures once you have them? And then problem solving skills. How do you put all those things together? Maybe in word problem form. Calculating money, calculating time, things like that. Understanding the application of mathematics. The next area is what we call written expression. And things get a little bit tricky here, because this is a wide open area with lots of sub areas, but not all of them will help a child be eligible for a learning disability in written expression. The first thing we think of is handwriting. And handwriting in and of itself, bad handwriting, poor handwriting, does not qualify us for a learning disability. If it's super bad, we might get some help from an occupational therapist as what we call a related service. If the handwriting is so bad that the child needs some extra help, that might be something that we can do as an extra kind of thing, but that's not a qualifier in and of itself. Under the area of written expression, we're talking more the quality of writing. Some of these things that you see down at the bottom of this list. Spelling is not a qualifier. Capitalization, punctuation, even though those contribute to good writing, in and of themselves, those things will not get a person the status of a learning disability in written expression. We're looking more for these bottom 3 elements that you see on this list. The way a person uses vocabulary, organization, and theme development in putting their writing together to write a paragraph. Can they do that with some thought and with some organization and some meaning that comes together? So you say, well, very young children can't do that anyway. Kids in kindergarten, first, second. Well, at that level, we don't expect much in the way of written expression. We might just expect a student to write their name, maybe a sentence that says, my name is so-and-so, and I have my pet is a brown dog, or something like that. And we want to see how they put their thoughts together. but we don't have a lot of students that qualify with written expression disabilities at that level, because the expectation for written expression is pretty low at that level. The last area for learning disability, we've got reading, we've got math, we've got written expression, and then we've got oral expression or oral language. And within oral language, we've got two specific areas. We've got expressive language and we've got receptive language. So the way a person expresses themselves orally, and then the way they receptively receive language. So how do they listen? So we look for how a student uses oral language to express themselves, or how well a student comprehends the language that they hear. Now, not a hearing test, but more of an auditory processing issue. How do they take the information that they hear and process it and give it back to us? So we look at these two areas through some of the tests that we give. And what we usually do, if we see some red flags in this area, we usually pass this on to a speech language pathologist because they're the ones who dig deeper in this area and are specialists in the area of oral language. And so if we see a red flag with a student in this area, we usually pass that along, like I say, to a speech language pathologist. And they may say that the child has a language disorder, more specifically. So the definition talks about some of these other things. It talks about cognition, and your book says that there's a difference between cognition and intelligence. And that's kind of a fine line there. Cognition, the way they're talking about it here in the textbook and in this definition, is about the way an individual thinks. So how does a person think? We don't have learning disabilities in thinking. We've got learning disabilities in 4 areas: in reading, math, writing, and oral language. Those are the areas in which we have learning disabilities. Thinking or cognition is not one that we have in the school systems. It's kind of there in a fuzzy way in the definition, but it's not there in the way we define it for school purposes. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the way a child, strategizes, the way they organize themselves, the way they use their memory in school. The idea of metacognition, and I don't know if you've become familiar with that term yet, but it's a buzzword in the education community, and it means cognition means thinking, and meta means, I don't know what meta means exactly, but metacognition means thinking about thinking. So thinking about the way you think. So examining the way you think and thinking about how you do it and kind of planning about the way you think. Most kids with learning disabilities do not have this level of sophistication in their thinking. They're not thinking about how they think. They don't plan their learning. Usually they're pretty scattered. We do have some overlap with kids with attentional issues, attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity disorder, and learning disabilities. There is some comorbidity there. But a lot of these kids, and some of that is that frontal lobe. We have what's called executive functioning disorder, when a student has difficulty with organizational things. It's all in this frontal lobe. And that's where executive functioning comes in, where we think about the way we think, the way when we plan how we're going to learn, when we plan a lot of the things that we're going to do in an organized way. Hopefully, as you all have become college students, you have a have reached this level of metacognition, where you think about how you think and how you study and how you plan for your learning. That's what metacognition is. The strategies that you're going to use to be successful in your classes, how you're going to turn your attention to particular things. You've got to decide at the college level how you're going to divide your time. This class needs this much of my time. This one is a little easier. It's only going to require this much effort. That's metacognition. The strategies that are going to be useful in this class aren't going to be useful in that class. That's thinking about your thinking and strategizing and planning on your calendar. How much time I need to devote to these various efforts. And kids with learning disabilities have a really hard time with that. So sometimes we have to teach them the strategies that they need, rather than just expecting them to come up with those things on their own. Your textbook talks about each one of these things. We identify students with learning disabilities in several different ways. I've talked about this a little bit this semester. We have two primary modes. In Texas, we've got the one that we use most commonly is on your screen. It's the second bullet. It's standardized testing. And we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago when I said that if you're part of a referral committee, you're going to decide that a student in your class needs some assessment. Something's going on and things aren't quite right, and there might be something that needs to be identified as a disability. And so you would find your referral committee at your school. And as I told you a few weeks ago, that's oftentimes the school counselor, or perhaps it's the assistant principal, or there may be an instructional coach or someone like that who has that job. And you'll talk to that person, and then they'll refer that after you have a few meetings. And you may go through this response to intervention process where the student works their way up through those tiers to get the kind of help that they need. Or it may go straight to standardized assessment, standardized testing. The response to intervention process may also result in standardized testing at some point. But that's when someone with the training like I do for our students in the master's program at Tarleton, for our educational diagnosticians, that kind of person would come in and they would do an assessment with the student where they give them an IQ test, or sometimes we call that a test of cognition. And that individual would give the student the assessment, and then they would give them some tests that look at all of these academic areas that we've just talked about: reading, math, writing, and oral language. And then they would look for differences and areas that stand out, areas of strength and areas of weakness. And most of our school districts across Texas right now identify students through this means, by looking at a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in cognition, the way a student thinks, and their achievement, the way they perform in those academic areas. And if they find a pattern of strengths and weaknesses between those two things, then they would identify the student as having a learning disability. That's primarily the way we do it in Texas right now. Now, we can use this response to intervention process, where if a child fails to respond to intervention through enough of the tiers, then we would say that that child has a learning disability. But that's not a very common method in Texas. Most of the districts across Texas still like to use the standardized testing procedure. And then your textbook looks at a few different ways that we would assist students who have learning disabilities. Once that process has completed itself, the identification process, and the student comes back to you and you know that there is a learning disability in one or more of those areas, reading, math, writing, or oral language, then what are you going to do? Because these days, the vast majority of students who have learning disabilities don't go down the hall to a special education classroom. They stay in the general education setting. And then you've got to know, as the general ed teacher, what are you going to do for that student? Now, hopefully the special education teacher will assist you in some way to look at that student's IEP, their individualized education plan, to know some things that you can do in your regular education classroom to assist the student. Your textbook talks about a number of those, how you can change your approach to the content. And I put your page numbers here so you can look specifically at those. Each one of those academic areas, how can you change your approach as a general education teacher to make the content more accessible to students who have learning disabilities? Your instructional procedures, what can you do differently with the way you deliver the instruction to make things more accessible to students with disabilities? And then finally, the instructional environment. What can you do to change the way your classroom is set up, where you have the student seated, who the student is surrounded by, the types of learning aids you have in your classroom, things like that, that may assist the student who has a learning disability in your classroom. So your book talks about all of these things, and those will be a part of your chapter 4, things that you need to know for the next test, test 2. This week, we've got test 1 opening up, and I'll open it tomorrow, and I'll probably leave it open for about a week. Since we had originally talked about it closing on Sunday, I'll probably leave it open until next Tuesday or Wednesday. But this is the last screen here, the last slide here about learning disabilities. Do you all who are on have any questions about learning disabilities? Okay. Then let's see. I'll open up the discussion board for this chapter tonight. I'll extend the deadline on that. You don't have to have your first comments by Thursday. We'll extend that through the weekend. And I'll probably let the discussion board itself go into next week. And I'll let your reflections for this chapter go into next week also. So all of our deadlines for this week will be extended since people are having trouble with internet and Canvas and all of those kinds of things. I'll put all of that on an announcement and put it on the due dates as well. Any questions? If you're still looking for your partner for application activity 1, I'm going to try to get those all set up tonight or tomorrow and get that to you in an email. So anybody that's waiting on that, you should have that by Wednesday, and then you'll have until next Wednesday to finish that project. Anybody else?
No, ma'am.
Okay, well then, if there are no more questions, I'm going to call it a night. And you all stay safe and warm.
You too.
And I'll see you next week then. Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Y'all take care. Bye, folks.